Today we'll have Dr. Debby Hamilton presenting on the immune system and specifically how ImmuneMedix pertains to the immune system. Dr. Debby Hamilton is a pediatrician with experience in primary care, integrative medicine, research, speaking, and writing. She's board certified in pediatrics, physician nutrition, integrated holistic medicine, functional medicine, and is a fellow of the Medical Academy of Pediatric Special Needs. Dr. Hamilton has her master's degree in public health, where she did research on nutrition. Dr. Hamilton founded Holistic Pediatric Consulting in Colorado in 2005. Her practice focuses on treating children and adults with chronic diseases such as autism and ADHD, PANS and PANDAS, mood and behavioral issues, and chronic infections, along with preconception counseling based on her book, Preventing Autism and ADHD, Controlling Risk Factors Before, During, and After Pregnancy. Dr. Hamilton is an employee of NutraMedix, where she is our Director of Product Education and Clinical Research. So, Dr. Debby, I think we can get this show on the road.
Okay, sounds good. All right, everyone, thank you for being here. As I said, this is ImmuneMedix training. So I wanted to start with immune system, just an overview, just to kind of get some context about, why we made ImmuneMedix and kind of how to use it. So overview of the white blood cells immune system. So there's lymphoid stem cells, there's myeloid stem cells, and I'll even go in a little bit, but you think about B cells, T cells, natural killer cells. The natural killer cells we're going to focus on in terms of ImmuneMedix. And then granulocytes, neutrophils, eosinophils, you see those little dots, all those are molecules that are released into the immune system for the action. So the majority of the immune system is in the digestive tract. You can't get away from the whole, it's really the gut immune, but it's the gut-brain immune system. About 70 to 80% of immune cells live within the digestive system. So really think about kind of your first line immune system. So there's two types of immune response, the innate, which is immediate immune response, and the adaptive, which is acquired or developed. So, innate immune system, these are all the cells, no matter what comes into the body, you get a release and activation of cells. I said natural killer cells is something we're going to talk a lot about. Eosinophils, mast cells actually bridges both of those. And then B cells and T cells, they actually create more of an immune response, a memory response, right? So we have our first line, and then we have our memory response. So lymphocytes, specifically natural killer cells, and they really are as they're described. They're a type of immune cell that can recognize and kill infected or abnormal cells in the body. So they recognize specific molecules on the surface of abnormal cells, right? So there's kind of like, a receptor. And then this triggers a natural killer cell to release toxic substances that kill the target cell. And it's really important for fighting viruses, right? A virus infects a cell, and that cell is then puts on signals on the outside that says it's abnormal in order for the immune cell system to recognize it and to get rid of that abnormal cell. So B cells release antibodies, and we're all familiar with the antibodies. That's what we measure when we're measuring, immune reactions to Lyme disease or Epstein-Barr, or measuring antibodies, different kinds of antibodies that are memory cells or memory antibodies, right? B cells are memory cells. And T cells get a little more complicated. We know that there's cytotoxic T cells. We think of the CD8 cells, and then the T helper cells. The T helper cells are CD4 cells, but there's multiple different types. And one of the things that happens with a lot of our patients who have chronic Lyme or autism or autoimmune disease, mold, the things we see, is immune system gets dysregulated or imbalanced. And part of this imbalance actually involves some of the T cells, specifically some of the T helper cells. So in this chart, this kind of goes into some of the basic four, right? There's Th1, Th2, Th17, and Treg cells, regulatory cells. So if you look at, all of these are cytokines. So if you have a naive CD4 cell, if these cytokines are released, then a Th17, it basically develops into a Th17. So the same thing, TGF-beta, we think about what we measure in the blood, a Treg cell. And then the Th1, interferon gamma, that's a classic one, development of Th1. And then what cytokines do they release? So Th1, interferon gamma, and you think about these. So these are the cytokines that help in development, and these are the cytokines that are released by Th1. These are the cytokines that are released by Th2. And if you look at things like interleukin-4, interleukin-5, those are really cytokines for a lot of allergic reactions, right? Th17, we think more of autoimmunity. We think of interleukin-17. And one of the classic cytokines, interleukin-23, is the one really important for Th17. So just kind of getting this. And in a lot of our chronic patients, this gets really imbalanced. So we get more of the Th17, we get more of the autoimmune potential. We get more of the Th2, we get more of the allergic potential. And then if you look at Th1, this is one of the ones that we need to fight infections. So if this is down, then our body can't fight these chronic infections as well. So this imbalance is something really to think about. And when we're talking about modifying and balancing the immune system, this is kind of one area that's important to understand. So kind of in a summary, the way I think about it is Th17. So when this is out of balance, these two are balanced, and these two are balanced, and these two are balanced. So what happens is you get some inflammation, you get elevation of the Th17, you get more autoimmune kind of patterns, more autoimmune issues. This leads to a decrease in Th1. Sorry about my little cursor here. Which leads to more infections, right? Because the body can't fight the infections, and specifically viral infections. And it's also inflammation. And Tregs is important for immune tolerance. So if you're having a decrease in immune tolerance, you have increased autoimmune potential, right? So you're really trying to have this balance. And then when you have elevated Th2, it's also inflammatory. But then you talk about allergies, asthma, and that part of the immune system. So one of the things that actually leads to elevated Th17 and autoimmunity is the whole leaky gut. And, we all know about leaky gut. We got a lot of our immune system in the digestive tract. We have different allergens. We basically literally have a break in the tight junctions of the cells. And a lot of these allergens get into the immune system, and you get inflammation, you get more autoimmune tendency. And this leaky gut also leads to broken immune tolerance, right? So you get the increase in Th17 cells, more autoimmune, and a decrease in the T regulatory cells. So a lot of times when we're trying to kind of balance the immune system, these are some of the things that we're trying to do. So people sometimes ask, well, hey, how do I measure these T helper cells? And there are some very kind of, I would say, panels that you can do. And some of these, I said, are more expensive panels. But there is kind of some, if you're looking at a CBC, there are some kind of hints in terms of what happens. So when we think of the Th17, one of the cells that it impacts is the neutrophils. So if you see an increase in percentage of neutrophils on your CBC, that's kind of a clue that, oh, maybe we have an increase Th17. Maybe we have an increase in autoimmune. And so when I see it kind of 60 or above in terms of percentiles, that's something to think about. And I think that that's kind of an easy way just to get an idea. And in terms of Th2, I always look at eosinophils. I think, we've been taught that eosinophils are very much an allergy cell. So sometimes you'll see that elevated. Macrophages and dendritic cells, the Th1. So you're looking at your monocytes. And then these are the antigen-presenting cells. But as I said, looking at the neutrophil percentage can kind of give you a kind of a nice hint. So cell signaling, there's lots of cell signaling, I think, are really about cytokines. There's also chemokines, growth factors. Some of our hormones are really cell signaling. Transcription factors, people talk about a lot about NRF2 and NF-kappa beta, about like what different things, think about the different herbs, how do they influence these kind of transcription factors? Protein kinases, free radicals. So cytokines are really a messenger from one cell to the other. Something impacts this cell, it sends all these cytokines to impact the other. The immune system is really great on communication. So when we also think about immune products, we also kind of think, well, how is this affecting the cytokines, and how is it affecting different parts of the immune system, and how is it affecting inflammation? These cytokines are protein, but really they're messengers that tell this cell what to do. So types of cytokines, there's some, the classic pro-inflammatory ones, tumor necrosis factor, interleukin-6, interleukin-8, interleukin-1. I mentioned interleukin-17 and 23, thinking specifically of Th17. And then the anti-inflammatory ones, I always think of interleukin-10 as one of the ones. That's kind of common. But some of these cytokines, you know, are not always pro-inflammatory and always anti-inflammatory. So I said a very complex system. When you think about the immune system, I always think it is so complex. And then we have to break it down, which I'm trying to do it, into categories enough that we understand it, knowing that there's so many other levels. Like I'm not talking about complement and some of the other pathways tonight. So NF-kappa B, this is a pro-inflammatory pathway. The body, as I said, if different things are activating NF-kappa B, then this basically starts an inflammatory response. So if you have an infection, great, you want to start the inflammatory response. But it's inflammatory, you're making cytokines, and this response isn't turned off, then these cytokines and these different things come back and activate NF-kappa B, which is one of the ways that you get this chronic inflammatory pathway. So if you have different herbs or different things that are inhibiting NF-kappa B, it's one way that you're stopping that chronic inflammatory cycle. And then NRF2, I think about the opposite. It's a regulator of the antioxidant system. So as NF-kappa B is escalating the inflammatory response, the NRF2 is basically escalating an anti-inflammatory or antioxidant system response. So as I said, this is kind of a complicated, I said, transcription factor, and you get increase in antioxidants, but a lot of the anti-inflammatory herbs that, you know, can inhibit NF-kappa B will activate NRF2. So sometimes you'll see things that you'll see, oh, this is a NRF2 activator. And these are some of the ways that these herbs actually work to help chronic inflammation. So granulocytes are, like you said, these are all the different molecules that are released. I think the mast cells, we do have a mast cell product coming out, and so I'll be talking about that next month. And basically that's how these cells, they release these different molecules, and that's what causes the healthy immune system. You know, eosinophils, allergies, neutrophils are really our first responders for infections. Some of these granules are actual enzymes. And again, if you see the increase in neutrophils, think about Th17 kind of an imbalance. Basophils actually release histamine and cytokines, can also have a component of allergies. And the mast cells release histamine, a lot of cytokines, neurotransmitters, hormones, many, many different things. So probably have more and more impact than we even know yet. I think we're still learning about how complicated some of these cells are. And I said the mast cells, again, talking about this more, but this is the classic where the IgE, the antibody that is involved in allergies, binds to receptor, triggers the mast cells, and releases histamine and other cytokines. So in terms of immune system, so we're going to talk about things. So there's ways, you know, we talked about the imbalanced immune system. So when you have people who are sick, you know, sometimes you want to enhance the immune system, right? You want to strengthen it, especially if you're talking about acute infection. You want to increase the innate immunity. You want to increase that innate or immediate immunity, and thinking really natural killer cells. There's also some immune system modulation and balance. And a lot of if you have Th1, you need that enhancing and increasing Th1, you're increasing the natural killer cells, increasing the body's ability to fight infection. But the modulation, we talked about how much is out of balance. So we need to kind of bring that Th1 and do some immune strengthening, but also bring some of the autoimmune, because people with certain autoimmune diseases, especially if they're very active, we don't want to tip that too much in that direction either. We want to decrease that allergic response by decreasing the Th2. And we want to increase immune tolerance, which helps balance autoimmunity. So I think that's really important when we talk about ImmuneMedix and we talk about the different herbs in terms of immune enhancing herbs, immune modulating, and some herbs, as I said, these are botanicals, and these are herbs that can do a lot of different things, and which is also why you combine them because of synergy. But we'll kind of talk about that, and I think that's important to think about when you're thinking about your patients, treating your patients. So think about, like, if you're having a patient sick, they get the flu, what are you going to do for immune strengthening? You think of nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, selenium, immune supplement like transfer factors, which are from T helper cells, or the antibodies that are in colostrum. And you think about antimicrobial herbs that help the immune system. And then you think immune enhancing herbs. And ImmuneMedix, which is a combination of herbs that I'll talk about, has a lot of immune enhancing herbs, including astragalus, which is well known. But other herbs that people use, think about elderberry. That's a classic immune enhancing herb, or echinacea. And then you think about immune modulating. So it's immune homeostasis, which is, again, balancing those T helper cells, balancing kind of the innate immune system, balancing kind of the adaptive immune system. So cemento, which is cat's claw, we know it as one of the first line antimicrobials, especially for Lyme disease. But the cemento that we have, a cat's claw, is a very specific type of cat's claw, which is the POA chemotype, which basically means it is an immune modulating, so immune homeostasis. To me, that's right, immune homeostasis in terms of basis. So that's important, and that's a part of ImmuneMedix. So we also have Etunia, and Etunia actually is known for helping that Th2 response, right? So it's helping balance the IgE, it's helping modulate the mast cells and decreasing that Th2 response. Michael skullcap is another one that has immune modulating. And you'll notice that a lot of these are also antimicrobial. Again, and anti-inflammatory. So a lot of the herbs are, one of the beautiful things about using herbs is they have so many different functions that they're doing a lot of different things for us. But this, as I said, really concentrating on how we are impacting the immune system. And then noni is another immune modulating herb. So ImmuneMedix, and again, I'll get into more specifics, has both immune stimulating and immune modulating herbs. And it does contain both cemento and skullcap. So I talked a little bit about this, but acute inflammation starts with innate immunity, and that's normal. So when we say anti-inflammatories, we're really talking about chronic inflammation. People with chronic disease have chronic inflammation. Without acute inflammation and innate immunity, we couldn't fight infections, we couldn't heal from injury. People get stuck in that kind of chronic, recurrent NF-kappa B, that chronic inflammatory cycle, right? Which adds more and more cytokines, more and more tissue damage, more and more pain, inflammation. And really what we want to do is one of the things is get these people out of chronic inflammation and help balance the immune system and strengthen it so it, as I said, so we can fight infections and decrease inflammation. So really, which is why the herbs can do all of these things. So in terms of chronic disease, I'm trying to think of any chronic disease that doesn't have chronic inflammation. And the things that we treat, from autoimmune disease, you can never get away from kind of dysbiosis, disrupted microbiome, which I think is common in most people with chronic illness, including some of the people I see or my kids with autism. Our poor diet, our nutritional deficiencies, toxins, chronic allergies, neuroinflammatory disease, chronic drug use, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular stress, chronic infections, our Lyme, people who have Lyme, people with mold, and then mast cell activation. So really, if we're treating chronic patients, we're treating chronic inflammation. So signs and symptoms of chronic inflammation, if you think about all of our patients, they're really very nonspecific symptoms, which is why sometimes you have, well, do they have mold? Do they have Lyme? Do they have toxin exposure? Or, combinations of thereof, or which infection they have. But general pain, fatigue, swelling, think about our just signs of inflammation, chronic digestive issues. I have a lot of patients, even talking to people today, chronic Lyme, and they're like, why can't I lose weight? I'm having all these issues with weight and all these hormone issues, brain fog, mood issues. So really kind of a lot of very non-specific, but common signs. So ImmuneMedix is a combination, and this is a Dr. Cowden formula. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Dr. Cowden. It's a combination of the noni fruit, and it's a combination of some herbs that we have individually, plus a combination of other ones. So there's noni, astragalus, the Baikal skullcap, ligustrum, boreal. I'm not even trying to say that, but definitely there's several mushrooms, and people know that how immune activating mushrooms are. Goji berry, prunella, white peony. So really a combination, white peony being a Chinese herbal product, reishi cordyceps, and then arsenito. So in terms of mechanism of action, so a lot of these herbs are have a great support for natural killer cells. Right? And we think about that's our first line immunity, great for viruses, but it also impacts other immune cells. And we went through the research of, the different individual ingredients. And at the end of this, we have a chart, which I said we can even give to people, but it's a summary of, the different herbs and the different parts of the immune system that it impacts. So it does affect other immune cells, including macrophages, dendritic cells, T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, and microglia. Microglia being the immune cells in the brain. It also increases cytokines, and cytokines, again, part of how the white blood cells communicate. So noni, as I said, we have noni, which is morinda. We know it's antibacterial, antiviral, antifungal, antihelminth. So really very antimicrobial for multiple different kinds of microbes, analgesic, so helping with pain, blood pressure, anti-inflammatory, but also has immune enhancing, but also immune modulating effects. And again, it's part of ImmuneMedix. In terms of research, some of the immunostimulatory effects, activation of natural killer cells, and also impacting both the innate and the adaptive immune responses. So astragalus, I think people are more familiar with astragalus. It actually is an adaptogen. It is part of our adrenal formula, so it helps modulate stress. It's an immune stimulant. It is it's very good for kind of acute, which is why ImmuneMedix can be used for acute infections, and you can even dose it higher for acute infections. Anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, which most of the herbs are, as I said, supporting the liver and the kidneys, blood sugar, and also very neuroprotective. So a lot of great functions for astragalus. These are some of the immune modulatory effects in terms of promoting macrophages, natural killer cells, dendritic. Think about really this herb affecting many of the different immune components. And even talked about kind of balancing some of the fatty acid metabolism, which I thought was interesting. So we know the Baikal skullcap, which is a Chinese skullcap. And this is different than the American skullcap, the Lateriflora, which is much more of a neurologic kind of anti-anxiety herb. We use this for Borrelia, antimicrobial, but it's also an immune modulator, and it's also neuroprotective. Some of the research in terms of how it helps the brain and neuroprotective, in terms of even, in terms of prevention of amyloid beta toxicity, increases BDNF in terms of neuroplasticity. So very supportive of cognitive function and immune function. And this is just some of the research that shows how many of the different, neurotransmitters it affects in terms of mood. I said I treat a lot of kids and even some adults with a lot of mood issues. And if you think about a lot of our chronic patients with Lyme and mold, mood and depression, brain fog, anxiety is all common part of these. So ligustrum, lucidum, they look like little grapes. They are made from the fruit. Here, the anti-osteoporosis, anti-inflammatory, but again, more immune modulation and liver protective. And And this is just kind of a show here. We talk about the osteoporosis, but really just anti-inflammatory, liver protection, really kind of just breaking out also some mood support, antioxidant. So Poryococcus mushroom, this is interesting. And when we actually saw this in the office, they literally are like, you look at these little white squares, they literally come in this. And what they are is they're the portion of that's under the filaments that are under the mushroom cap. And so they literally come as these white squares. Really strong, the research is really strong in terms of immune modulation and anti-inflammatory, but a really good immune support. As we know, mushrooms really tend to be that way. And this is really just talking about specifically how it's affecting natural killer cells, impacting the Th1, Th2, kind of blocking the Th2, right, and increasing the Th1 in terms of trying to balance that system. Lycium barbarum, which is goji. And again, you don't think about, but if you look at all the different immunoregulatory impacts, antioxidant, even anti-aging, again, a lot of our different chronic diseases. So also effects on, I said, prebiotic activity, so supporting the digestive immune support. Prunella vulgaris. This is an herb that actually has something called heal all as this kind of its nickname. So you know that it has a wide range of activities. Cardioprotective, anti-allergic, anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial. So this has been another traditional drug. And you look at the herbs, this is really kind of like a multinational combination of different herbs. So cemento, as I said, very specific type of cat's claw, immune modulator, anti-inflammatory. We have antimicrobial and a lot of good studies in terms of Lyme disease. Blood glucose, blood pressure, and as you know, cemento is in ImmuneMedix, but it's also in some of our other products. And this just talks about that if you have the TOA alkaloids in it, that it's an immune stimulator, but when you have the POAs, which we have, that's more of an immune modulator. And I like that the combination of these different herbs and the different support it has. So this is the chart that kind of summarizes, all of the different herbs and then all of the different, basically different immune products, immune cells that it helps, the natural killer cells. And we divided it in innate immunity and then the adaptive immunity, and really kind of supporting a lot of the different type cells. So you really think about how this is supporting the immune system. And as you know, they're all anti-inflammatory. And then, as I said, if you didn't get enough immunology tonight, then you can get the brief summary of all these different cells too. So we put this together for practitioners, and we do have it at conferences, just as a kind of a reference, kind of a summary of all that. So that is what I'm going to talk about tonight, but we do have a lot of time for questions. So I'm going to stop my share at this time and kind of go through some of the Q&A. And I said, if you come up with a question later, you're also very welcome to get in touch with us if something inspires you after this. So I'm going to stop my share. Too bad I can't keep that up, right? It'd be nice to keep that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Debbie. That was fantastic.
Oh, good. I'm glad. As I said, sometimes it's good to really kind of think about the immune system and what we're doing. So the questions so far really are about getting a copy of this presentation and the slides, which I'm sure that we can do. This is being taped, so I think we can do that. One of the other things that when you think about natural killer cells and abnormal cells, that natural killer cells are also designed to see if there's been kind of changes that are adjusting the receptors on the cell, that the natural killer cells can also be important for those kind of abnormal cells. In terms of dosing, the doses is 1 dropper. I think it's 1 to 2 droppers twice a day. For acute illness, I think you could, and I'll do it like 3 or 4 times a day. I usually do 1 dropper. So I think that there's definitely flexibility in whether you're acutely ill or you're using it more chronically. I do, as I said, I kind of do dose it. In terms of kids, my general rule is if a child is kind of 10 and over or over 100 pounds, I dose them as an adult, although I'll always start with the lowest dose. 5 to 10, I do a half dose, and 2 to 5, I do a quarter dose. And again, I use a lot of different herbs. I use in much younger kids too. And the good thing about herbs and the liquid tinctures, you can literally do 1 or 2 drops too. So it's easy to really have a variety, kind of a difference in doses.
And I'm just going to interrupt here for a second. I forgot to mention at the beginning for questions that you should see a Q&A like little blurb at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, please go down there and type those into the Q&A.
Okay. Okay. So in terms of doses, I always start with the lowest dose. Like I never go, and this is true with any of the herbs, is I never go and suddenly give like the full dose. Right? Because you want to always make sure people can tolerate it. So it's good to, as I said, I usually start with a couple drops, or with the ImmuneMedix, you could start with just 1 drop or full once a day. With kids, I usually start with a couple drops and see how they do. But I think it's always good to kind of go up slowly. So which supplements, there's a question about a child with pandas, and then there's also some questions about autoimmune disease. So when I think of my kids with pandas, if they are kind of in a very active flare, I'm not going to use ImmuneMedix then. And I think that there's immune modulating in it, and I think it's different than like I wouldn't give somebody elderberry. So ImmuneMedix is more of a combination. So people with kind of chronic autoimmune disease, and you're trying to balance that Th17 and get them back, then yes, I'd use ImmuneMedix. If they're an acute flare, like a kid with pandas, I wouldn't use it at that time. And I don't know if that makes sense. And if you got a stable autoimmune disease, but you know that they're still kind of ongoing, then that would be much more comfortable. In terms of pandas, PANS is, right, any of the different infections. So there's a lot of herbs that I use in pandas. I look for what's causing it. Is it mycoplasma? Today I had a child with Bartonella and strep. And then I treat the infections. And a lot of these are immune modulating. So I also like using them for that. So always immune modulating herb and then targeting the infection. I also use Berberpanella a lot in terms of, think about it, herx and detox kind of prevention and maintenance. So like using 1 dropper full twice a day, but also talking to patients about how you can really use it every hour acutely. I usually use some kind of liver support. Berberpanella has some liver support. I do kind of look at glutathione markers, and that's something I also can use in pandas. That's definitely a very complicated, that's like a whole, I use a lot of things like Avea, which is turmeric, which is anti-inflammatory, but also is really good for the mood and calming. And that's really easy in terms of kids. So really kind of a combination. So in terms of which herbs help remediate low white blood cells and neutrophils, as I said, the herbs in there and the research shows that it does increase a lot of the different white blood cells and the neutrophils. So ImmuneMedix could be very helpful. There's a question about combining ImmuneMedix with other tinctures. I use it with other tinctures all the time because I'll use some tinctures that are antimicrobial and more immune modulating. And then if I'm trying to strengthen the person's ability to fight infection, I add ImmuneMedix. Also with the kind of caveat, if they get sick, to kind of up it to like 3 times a day. So yes, I use it with a lot of other tinctures. And with my kids, I want tinctures to get in, so I mix a lot of things together. because I think it's more important to get the herbs in. Here it talks about what would you recommend for flare motor tics. If I'm thinking of ticks, I'm thinking of pandas. So then I'm going back to what infection are you looking for, and then treating that infection. And kind of ticks, a lot of people think about strep with some of the ticks. So the next question is about a teenager with autoimmune thyroiditis. So autoimmune thyroiditis, again, I look for infections, specifically Epstein-Barr or different viral infections. Kind of thinking always, what is the cause of the thyroid issues? If you're thinking thyroiditis and inflammation, you're also treating the infection. Ashwagandha actually is one that helps load the thyroid, but also anti-inflammatory. Usually when they have autoimmune thyroiditis, they have gut issues, they have a lot of other issues too. But I always look for the infection and then treat the infection, if that's helpful. Okay.
So I know. Oh,
sorry.
Sorry to interrupt again. I noticed a question earlier on. It might have been missed. It was in between a few about dosing. So
Yes.
just like, do you titrate dosing like you do with, say, our antimicrobial herbs?
You're not like expecting die-off, so it's not the same. So I'd be comfortable if somebody's sick, I just dose it full, and you're kind of dosing it high just to try to help them fight the infection. Does that make sense? So say you're coming down the flu, you're not going to like, oh, I'll do 2 drops now and then 2 drops the next day. It's like, no, you're going to do like 1 dropper full 2 or 3 times a day. Or even no. I know that people do it 2 dropper fulls twice a day. So it's different in terms of stimulating the immune system. And so I would start it no more than once a day. And in kids, I would definitely start with a couple drops, but you definitely don't have to work up drop by drop the same way because you're not worried about die-off. You're actually trying to get the immune system to work better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. 100%.
Okay. So in terms of, I talked about some of I'm trying to think of the cases I've used it. I mean, as I said, if you have, somebody with an acute infection, it's great to have on hand because then you can give 1 dropper, 2 dropper fulls, 2 times a day, 3 times a day. So I definitely travel with it as something just kind of, really give your immune system a boost so you can fight infection. People who seem like they can't, and I'm trying to think of somebody I just saw who seems like they're just not fighting like chronic infections or even chronic Lyme, like their immune system. And you look at the results when they are like the people who have got the IgM elevated, so they really haven't switched from the acute to kind of a chronic. They got the chronic Epstein-Barr, they've got chronic infections, and you're really not able to you're treating the infections, but it seems like their immune system needs help. And so I've added ImmuneMedix in that case to really kind of try to help balance and help their body fight, right? Because Lyme and some of these infections are very tricky. They kind of fool your body into not being able to fight it the right way. So we really want to bring that immune system back into balance and kind of stimulate the acute stuff, the natural killer cells, so we know, thinking about supporting the Th1 system so you can fight the infection. So I think those are the cases where I use it. When I have people who have gone through Lyme or have gone through and they're kind of, on just a low dose of herbs or they've kind of gone through it, then I'm also knowing that, hey, if they get COVID or they get the flu, this might kind of trigger their Lyme again. So then I'll put them on ImmuneMedix as kind of a baseline. So really with the idea of like, okay, their immune system, they're doing better. Let's not get them sick. Let's not get their immune system weaker so they kind of flare again, I guess, if you want to say it that way. So, and then I said with kids or adults. So if you're talking about just Bartonella, Kumanda, and Atunia and NutraBRT is that combination. Japanese knotweed is one of my favorite just because it gets so many things. Bartonella, Babesia, and Lyme, and viruses. So I think that I have actually started to add like the knotweed onto like the NutraBRL or the NutraBRT. And kind of like, so there's more than one coverage for some of these infections. In terms of strep, barberry is actually really good for strep. Has berberine in it, from Aragon grapefruit. It's the same kind of compound. Noni is actually good. There's a lot of different like combinations. So, and also if I think about even strep in the gut, I'll add barberry as kind of like a dysbiosis to some of these other combinations. So there's a question about toxoplasmosis. So I said I see a variety of infections and variety of infections that we don't normally see or treat. So again, I think, okay, and that's why I think herbs are great because they cover so many different things. Japanese knotweed, I said, such a great antiviral and great at different infections. Kumanda is another one that treats a lot of different infections. So I would do a combination of different herbs that cover a lot of different types. But as I said, I can't say I've had a lot of experience with toxoplasmosis, especially in terms of research for our specific herbs. But that I said I usually do some broad coverage and multiple ones. That's helpful.
All right. I think that's everybody in here. Oh, here we go. One more.
What about the sinuses? Sinuses can be, staph or strep or mold. Again, so I kind of think about some of the things like barberry. Again, if you're thinking about antifungal, Kumanda, so I probably would use that kind of combination. And then obviously you got to look at the gut too and treat the gut.
All right. Well, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email those in to info@professional.nutramedix.com. We'll make sure we get answers for you. If you're sitting at home later tonight and you think, oh, that would have been a great question, please send that over. Thank you so much, Dr. Debby. That really was fantastic. I think there was a ton of pearls, a ton of information to pull from that. In addition to that, I just want to let you know that we have a big summit this year. We've done one just about every year in the past, for the past 5 years or so. This year, it's going to be in Greenwich, Connecticut on April 18th. We've got Dr. Debby, Teresa Haller, and some other amazing providers that are going to be there sharing their clinical experience and expertise with everybody. You're able to join in person or online. The information's on our website. You can email us. We'll make sure we provide any additional information you'd like to see. But that's definitely going to be a great event. We'd love to see all of you there.